He was the most feared man alive, and he was dying in secret. Alpha King Kaelor Draven had crushed armies, broken bloodlines, and made entire nations kneel. But no enemy blade ever brought him low. It was something older than war, something he couldn't fight with his hands. And tonight, somewhere out in the dark beyond the palace walls, a woman he's never met is the only reason his heart is still beating. You won't believe what she does when she realizes who he is. Stay with me until the end. Hit that like if this empire gets under your skin, and drop your city in the comments. My tribe deserves to be seen. The scout came back with blood on his boots and a look in his eyes that said he'd rather be flogged than deliver the message he was carrying. He stood in the war room doorway for 3 full seconds before Commander Adris Vane turned around and saw him. "Speak," Vane said. "The king collapsed in the eastern corridor," the scout said, 20 minutes ago. He wouldn't let anyone send for court physicians. They moved him to the armory antechamber. He ordered the doors sealed." Vane was already moving before the sentence finished. The armory antechamber smelled like iron and old stone and the particular kind of damp that seeped into the lower palace when the rains came heavy off the mountains. 2 king's guards stood outside the door with their faces carved into careful blankness, the kind that soldiers practiced when they needed to look like they weren't witnessing something that could get them killed for knowing about it. Vane didn't slow down. "Move." They moved. Inside, Kaelor Draven was sitting against the far wall on the stone floor like a man who had simply run out of the energy required to find something more dignified. He was still in his campaign leathers, the ones he'd worn through 3 days of border negotiations with the Velmoran delegates. His dark hair was stuck to his forehead with sweat. His jaw was clenched the way it always was when he was enduring something he refused to name out loud. He looked up when Vane entered, and his eyes were still sharp. That was the first thing you checked with Kaelor Draven. Always the eyes. If the eyes went dull, you started making decisions without him. The eyes were sharp. The rest of him was in serious trouble. "Commander," his voice came out level. That took effort. Vane could see it in the tendons of his throat. "My king!" Vane crouched to eye level without making a performance of it. "How bad?" "I'll be on my feet in 10 minutes. "That isn't what I asked." A long pause, the kind Kaelor used when he was deciding how much truth was tactically useful. "The episodes are closer together now," he said finally. "Used to be one every 3-4 weeks. This is the second one this month." Vane said nothing, because there was nothing useful to say to that. The curse? Nobody called it that inside the palace walls. Nobody except the old scholars in the restricted archive who used words like affliction and bound ruin, and spoke in the careful language of men who understood that some knowledge was physically dangerous to possess, had been living inside Kaelor Draven for 7 years. Since the War of the Ashen Peaks, since the night he'd walked into the temple at Korath and done what needed doing and walked back out with something attached to his bloodline that no amount of power could shake loose. 7 years of court physicians who smiled and bowed and prescribed tonics that did nothing. 7 years of episodes that knocked him flat for hours at a time, that sapped the particular kind of vitality that alphas ran on, the deep current of dominance and will that kept a man like Kaelor standing over everything he'd built. The Empire was watching. The Empire was always watching. Nobles who smiled to his face and counted down in private. Lords who had sons with ambition and daughters of marrying age and plans that required a vacancy on the Veridus throne. "The court physicians have been through the archives twice," Vane said quietly. "There's nothing more to try." "I know that. There are other options." "If you are about to say the name Malrek Thorn, I will have you demoted on principle." Vane almost smiled. Almost. Lord Thorn's healer network runs deeper than any. "Thorn is a carrion bird," Kaelor said. "He circles. He waits. He does not receive my medical history as a favor." He pressed the back of his head against the stone wall and let out a single slow breath through his nose. "Dismissed." "My king." "I said dismissed, Vane. I'll stand up in a few minutes and we'll both pretend this happened differently." Vane stood, looked at the man on the floor who controlled 200,000 soldiers and 100 territories and couldn't currently get upright without the room going sideways. Made a decision.
There's a healer, Vane said, in the lower districts of Caldrath. Word from the refugee corridors says she's worked on cases the court physicians turned away. Not a licensed practitioner. Works out of somewhere. Nobody gives the location freely. You have to be brought to her. Kaelor's eyes slid sideways toward him. An unlicensed healer in a refugee district. The accounts are specific enough to be credible. People who should have died. People who came back from afflictions that had no named treatment. I'm not claiming she can help with what you carry, my king. I'm saying she might be worth the embarrassment of asking. Another long pause. You've already made contact, Kaelor said. It wasn't a question. I reached out through a third party. A merchant who owes the crown a favor. She doesn't know who would be coming. She doesn't know anything about who I represent. Kaelor closed his eyes for exactly 5 seconds. When he opened them, the decision was already made. Vane could see it in the set of his jaw. Tonight, Kaelor said, no escort, no banners. If this gets back to the council, I'll hold you personally responsible. Understood. And Vane. The commander paused at the door. If she turns out to be a fraud, we don't discuss this again. If she turns out to be a fraud, Vane said carefully, you won't need to discuss it because you'll have other problems. He left before Kaelor could respond to that. Seraphina Vale had learned early that the people most likely to bleed on her floor were the people least likely to thank her for saving them. She learned it the first time at 17, when she dragged a collapsed dock worker into her mother's back room and spent 6 hours pulling fever out of his blood with her hands, and he woke up and accused her of stealing 3 copper coins from his belt pouch. She learned it again at 20, when the mate bond formed with Malrek Thorn, and she mistook his intensity for depth and his possessiveness for protection, and she spent 2 years finding out the difference between those things the painful way. Now she was 26, unbonded by force of documented rejection rather than mutual dissolution, which meant that in the hierarchy of Verithus society, she occupied a position somewhere between inconvenient and invisible. Former mate of a powerful lord. Omega without standing. Healer without a license because the licensing board in Caldrath required a sponsoring alpha, and the only alpha who'd ever sponsored her had done so in order to control what she knew and who she could speak to. She'd kept the knowledge. She'd given back everything else. Her sanctuary. She didn't call it a clinic because clinics had signs and paper records and tax obligations, occupied the lower floor of a converted grain warehouse at the edge of the refugee quarter. The upper floors were inhabited by a rotating population of displaced families from the border territories, people who paid rent in labor and silence, and occasionally root vegetables. The lower floor was hers. It had a hearth, a long stone table she used for examinations, shelves of compounds and dried preparations along the east wall, and 3 pallets in the back corner for patients who needed to be kept horizontal for more than a few hours. The space smelled like dried herbs and wood smoke and occasionally like blood, depending on what the week had brought her. The week had brought her a child with a bone-deep infected bite from a Velmoran scavenger creature, a pregnant woman whose labor had stalled dangerously, and an old soldier with shrapnel damage so old and so badly managed that her hands had been in his shoulder for 4 hours before she found the last fragment. She was cleaning the stone table when the knock came. Not the usual knock. The usual knock was desperate and fast, people who'd waited too long and were now in the crisis stage of whatever had been building. This knock was measured. 3 beats, pause, 2 beats. The pattern the merchant Aldous had given to someone who was coming tonight. Seraphina set down her cloth. She crossed to the door and opened it without putting the bar up between them first, because she'd decided weeks ago that she wasn't going to live like someone who was always preparing for the worst outcome. The decision was at least partly philosophical and at least partly practical. The bar wouldn't stop a determined alpha anyway, and the pretense of it only made her feel worse about her own situation. 2 men stood in the doorway, both in plain dark clothing that fit too precisely to be genuinely plain. The one on the left was broad and watchful, the particular kind of watchful that came from years of professional threat assessment. The one on the right was being held up by the first and was doing a poor job of hiding it. Her eyes went to the one on the right immediately and didn't leave him. He was tall, dark-haired. His face in the torchlight was all hard angles and old scars, and the specific gray complexion of someone whose body was fighting a losing war with something internal.
His eyes were open and conscious and tracking her with an alertness that was striking given how badly the rest of him was doing. Strong jaw, strong hands, one of them gripping the doorframe with more force than was strictly necessary, which was his way of managing the fact that without that grip he would be on the floor. She'd seen that particular technique before. "You're the healer," the watchful one said. "I'm a person who helps people," Seraphina said. "What does he have?" "We don't know," the watchful one said. "How long has he been like this?" "The episodes have been happening for 7 years. This one started about 3 hours ago." She looked at the man who was gripping her doorframe. He was looking back at her with the specific expression of someone who had exhausted their options and was confronting that fact without any particular grace. "You should have come 3 hours ago," she said. "I didn't want to be here at all," he said. His voice was low and rough and absolutely steady, which was its own kind of remarkable. "Well," she said, stepping back from the door. "Come in anyway." "What?" "His name was Kel," the watchful one said. "Just Kel. Traveling merchant passing through from the Northern Territories?" Seraphina didn't push on it. She'd learned that names were often the last thing people surrendered, and the name didn't change what she needed to do with her hands. She got him onto the examination table, which he submitted to with exactly the expression of a man who had spent his entire adult life being the person who gave orders rather than received them, and was now deeply uncomfortable with the reversal. He sat on the edge of the table and let her move his arm to check his pulse, and looked at the wall with his jaw still clenched and said nothing. His pulse was wrong. Not dangerously wrong, not the kind of wrong that meant heart failure or organ collapse, but wrong in a way that she'd only felt once before. In a soldier who'd come to her 2 years ago with an old battle wound that had something laced through it. A working, an old one, the kind that didn't come from licensed practitioners. She kept her face neutral. "I need to check something," she said. "I need to put both hands flat on your back. It won't hurt. I need you to hold still." "What are you checking for?" "The thing that's actually wrong with you," she said. "Your pulse is irregular in a specific way. I want to confirm what I think it means." He looked at her for a long moment. The watchful one, standing near the door with his arms crossed, also looked at her. "Do it," Kel said. She moved behind him and placed both palms flat against his back, below the shoulder blades, over the lungs. She closed her eyes and let her focus drop down through her hands the way her mother had taught her, the way that couldn't be explained in the vocabulary of licensed medical practice, because it sat in a different category of knowing entirely. What she found made her breath catch. She controlled it immediately, controlled the catch, controlled the small shock of recognition, kept her hands steady and her face blank, and let her focus move through the full shape of what was living inside him. It was deep, it was old. It was the most complex working she had ever touched with her bare hands, and she had touched things that had made court physicians declare men terminal, and she had brought those men back. This was different. This wasn't a wound. It wasn't a poison. It wasn't a curse in the crude sense, a simple hex laid by a practitioner with a grudge. This was something that had grown into him over years, that had taken root in the place where an alpha's vital force lived, and it was eating that vital force at a rate that was accelerating. She understood, suddenly and completely, that this man was dying. Not in the way that humans were always technically dying. In the way that meant years, not decades. In the way that meant the episodes would get closer and closer until the recovery time between them stopped existing. She kept both hands steady. "How long have you been told you have?" she asked, keeping her voice exactly as flat as she kept it when she was telling someone about a bone that needed resetting. A pause behind her. "No one's told me anything officially." "Off the record." Another pause. 5 years? Maybe 6 if I managed it carefully. "When was that estimate made?" 2 years ago. She absorbed that. "I can work on this tonight," she said carefully. "I can't promise how much I can do. What's inside you is old and it's had time to establish. But I can reach some of it. I want to try." She heard him exhale slowly. "What does trying look like?" he asked. "It looks like you lying flat on this table for about 3 hours while I work," she said. "It might hurt some. Not from anything I do intentionally. From the working itself reacting. It's been undisturbed for a long time,
Moving it will feel like moving a bone that healed wrong. And if I don't? Then you leave the same way you came in, and the estimate those physicians gave you was probably optimistic. She heard the watchful one shift near the door. Do it, Kel said. She worked from the root of it. That was the only way with old deep workings. You couldn't chip at the surface, couldn't trim the visible growth and expect the hidden parts to die. You went to where it had first taken hold, and you addressed it there, where the connection between the working and the man's own vital force was thickest and most entangled. It took her the better part of an hour just to map it fully, both hands moving in slow, careful passes across his back and his chest and his temples, while he lay face up on the table and stared at the ceiling with that clenched jaw going rigid and slack and rigid again depending on what she was touching. She talked while she worked. She didn't always do this, but it helped, with men who needed to feel like they still had some agency in a situation that had completely removed it from them. Tell me if you feel a sharp point rather than a pressure, she said. Tell me if your vision goes. Don't tell me if it just hurts, because it's going to hurt, and that's expected. Generous of you, he said dryly. You're handling it better than most, she said. Most people at this stage are either unconscious or making significant noise. I've been at this level for 7 years, he said. You get used to a certain amount. That's not something to be proud of, she said. That's something to be concerned about. The fact that your baseline has moved this far it's not a good sign. I'm aware. She moved her hands to the side of his neck, found the thread of the working there, began the careful work of loosening it from the surrounding tissue without pulling so hard that it snapped back. What did you do to earn this? She asked. She'd learned to ask directly. People who danced around the question in medical contexts didn't usually have useful answers. A long silence. The watchful one near the door very carefully didn't move. 7 years ago, he said at last, I did something necessary in a place that didn't agree with my definition of necessary, and something in that place registered its disagreement in a lasting way. A temple, she asked. She'd felt that quality in the working, the kind of old power that didn't come from a human practitioner, older than that. Among other things. What you did in there, she said carefully, I'm not asking whether it was right, I'm asking whether you've resolved it. He went still under her hands. What does that mean? He said. Workings of this kind, old power, the kind that comes from deep sources, they respond to context. They're not mechanical, they're reactive. They respond to whether the conditions that created them have changed. She kept her voice clinical because she was talking about something she only half understood herself. If what you did in that place was driven by something you haven't resolved in yourself, anger, grief, something you haven't looked at, then the working has something to feed on. It keeps finding purchase. The silence stretched out long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. I've thought about it, he said finally. What I did. The cost of it. Thinking about it isn't the same thing. No, he said quietly. I suppose it isn't. She worked for another 2 hours. The deeper she went, the more she found, not just the main root, but the network of secondary threads that had spread from it over the years, thin as wire, woven into the places where his body and his will connected. Pulling them carefully, one at a time, was exhausting in a way that went past the physical. Her hand stopped trembling when she was deep in this kind of work because the trembling would be counterproductive, but the rest of her felt it. He fell unconscious around the second hour. Not from blood loss, not from anything dramatic. He simply went under the way people went under when they'd been holding themselves upright through sheer force of will for so long that the release of even a little of the pressure sent them under completely. She kept working. The watchful one, she'd stopped thinking of him by the invented name and had been calling him commander in her head for about 90 minutes because of the way he stood and the way he assessed the room and the way he looked at the man on the table, moved closer when Kel lost consciousness. Is he sleeping? She said. That's good. It means his body trusts the situation enough to stop fighting. He doesn't sleep, the commander said. Not really, not more than a few hours. He'll sleep tonight, she said. She worked, and the hearth burned low. and outside the refugee quarter settled into its particular late-night quiet, which was not the quiet of peace, but the quiet of people too exhausted to move. And in the second hour past midnight, with her hands flat against the center of his chest and her focus pushed down to the deepest root of the working, something happened that she had not planned for and could not have predicted and had no framework to explain. The bond snapped open. Not gradually. Not the slow, warm current she'd heard described by bonded pairs who'd found their mates under normal circumstances. The gradual recognition, the gentle pull. This came in like a door blowing open in a storm. Sudden and overwhelming and completely impossible to close again, the full force of the mate bond hitting her nervous system all at once and leaving her standing there with her hands flat on this stranger's chest and her own breath coming apart. She knew him. Not his face, not his name, not his history. She didn't know any of those things. But she knew him the way the bond worked, at the level beneath names and histories, the recognition that the bonded part of her had been waiting for this specific person's resonance since she'd been old enough to feel it. The shape of him, the particular quality of his vital force, even through the damage the working had done to it. Her mate. She stood there for a full 10 seconds and breathed. Then she did something that she would spend the rest of her life examining and re-examining for whether it was cowardice or survival or simply the only honest choice available to her at the time. She made a decision. She kept working. She pulled the last accessible threads of the working free with more care than she'd used on anything in her life, because her hands were shaking now and she couldn't afford them to shake. She cleared what she could reach. She left the deepest root, the part that had been there longest, the part she'd have needed another 3 sessions to address fully, because she'd run out of time. When she was done, when she'd pulled back and her hands were her own again, and the bond was still burning in her chest like a coal she hadn't asked for, she stood at the edge of the table and looked at his face. He was unconscious, breathing slower and more deeply than she suspected he'd breathed in years. The gray had left his complexion. He looked, in sleep, like someone who had put a very heavy thing down and not yet picked it back up. She looked at the commander, who had been watching her for the last 20 minutes, with an expression that had shifted from professional assessment to something that was trying not to be alarm. "He'll wake up in a few hours," she said. "His color will be better. The episodes, I can't promise they're gone, but I've cleared the secondary system. The primary root is still there. That will take more work. When can you—" "He needs to drink this when he wakes up." She moved to the shelf, put together the compound without looking, hands moving through motions she'd done 1,000 times. "Not all at once. Small amounts. It'll help stabilize what I've done." She handed it to the commander and picked up her cloak from the hook by the back door. "You're leaving," he said. Not a question. Flat and careful and very watchful. "I need air," she said. "I've been working for 3 hours. I'll be outside." It wasn't technically a lie. She went out the back door into the alley behind the warehouse, and she stood in the cold with her hands wrapped around her own elbows and the mate bond burning in her chest, and she understood with absolute clarity that she was not going back inside. Because she knew what would happen if she was there when he woke up. Because she had felt the shape of him through his bones and his blood and his suffering, and she knew already that he was someone she could love, which was the most dangerous thing she had ever known about another person. Because the last powerful man she had loved had rebuilt her world into a cage around her, one stone at a time, until she couldn't see the walls anymore. Because she was no one in the hierarchy of Varathis, a rejected Omega with no standing, no license, no name worth protecting. And this man, the quality of his vital force, the depth of what she'd touched inside him, the way the commander had watched him with the specific devotion of someone whose entire professional existence was organized around one person's survival. This man was not a traveling merchant. She had known that the moment she touched him. She had kept knowing it and kept working anyway because it didn't change what her hands needed to do. She stood in the cold alley for a long time. Then she went to the loose stone behind the third barrel, the one where she kept the emergency pouch, and she took what was in it and she walked into the dark without looking back at the light coming through the warehouse window. She was half a mile into the refugee quarter when she heard, behind her and already distant, the sound of a door opening and a voice saying something in low, urgent tones. She didn't turn around. She walked. Inside the warehouse, the man who was not a traveling merchant opened his eyes. The first thing he felt was the absence of the pain, not the ordinary absence, the brief window between episodes that he'd spent 7 years cataloging and hoarding. The absence, deep and clean and extending in every direction, into places he hadn't felt clean in so long that he'd forgotten the shape of that feeling. He sat up. Vayne was at his side immediately, which meant Vayne had been watching him the entire time, which meant Vayne was not entirely as controlled as he appeared. "My king," Vayne said, and then stopped himself. "Where is she?" Kaelor said. Vayne's expression shifted. "She went outside," he said. "She said she needed air. That was—" He checked the window. The dark outside had not changed. 20 minutes ago. Kaelor was already off the table. The back door was open. The alley behind the warehouse was empty, except for a scattering of barrel staves and the smell of cold coming off the stone. He stood in the doorway and looked out into the dark and felt something he had no name for, something that had woken up in the same moment he had woken up, something that was telling him with absolute certainty that the woman who had just left this building was not a stranger. The mate bond. He'd heard it described. Every alpha had. He'd spent 20 years being fairly sure it was something that happened to other people, lesser people, people who needed that kind of anchor. Standing in the back doorway of a grain warehouse in the refugee quarter of Caldrath, at 2 hours past midnight, Kaelor Draven felt the full force of the mate bond like a blade between his ribs, and the woman attached to the other end of it was already gone. "Vayne," he said, "my king. I want her found." The silence that followed was the particular kind that preceded a very careful question. "My king," Vayne said, "we don't know her name. We don't know where she lives. We don't know—" "She was just in this room for 3 hours," Kaelor said. "Find a single person in this quarter who doesn't know where she works." He turned back from the doorway and met his commander's eyes, and the expression on his face was something Vayne had never seen there before. Not the cold strategic calculation of military decisions, not the hard public face of imperial authority. Something rawer than both. "She saved my life," Kaelor said. "And then she ran. I want to know why." He picked up the cloth she'd used, still damp, and held it for a moment before setting it back down. Outside, somewhere in the dark warren of the refugee quarter, the woman who carried the other half of something ancient was already making distance between them. She didn't know yet that Alpha King Kaelor Draven had never lost a pursuit in his life. He wasn't planning to start tonight. The refugee quarter of Caldrath did not sleep so much as it collapsed into itself after dark, folding down layer by layer until the streets held only the people who had nowhere to go and the wind that didn't care about any of them. Kaelor moved through it without torches. Vayne had argued for a full search team, 6 men, systematic grid pattern from the warehouse outward. Kaelor had shut that down in 2 sentences because a search team in the refugee quarter at this hour would close every door and seal every mouth within 20 minutes, and he needed mouths open. He moved alone. He'd shed the traveling cloak for something darker, something he'd borrowed off a peg inside the warehouse without asking whose it was. His own leathers still smelled like the examination table, like whatever compound she'd been using on her shelves, something sharp and green, medicinal but not unpleasant. The kind of smell that stayed in your memory without your permission. He noticed that, filed it, moved on. The bond was a direction more than a feeling. He hadn't expected that. Everyone who described it talked about warmth, about recognition, about emotional weight. Nobody had mentioned that it was navigational, that standing in the dark with the cold coming off the stones, he could feel which direction was toward her the way he could feel which direction was north. She was moving west, toward the outer corridors of the quarter, toward the places where the refugee settlements gave way to open road. He walked faster. The first person who'd seen her was a woman selling hot grain broth from a clay pot at the corner of the 3rd alley, too old and too tired to be bothered by an alpha walking toward her without explanation. She looked up when his shadow fell across her. "The healer," he said. "Younger woman. She came through here recently." The woman looked at him for a long moment with the particular assessment of someone who had seen a lot of powerful men come through her corner of the world and had learned to read what kind of trouble they represented. "You her patient?" the woman said. "Yes." "You look better than most of hers do when they leave." She gestured west with her ladle. "She came through maybe 20 minutes past.
moving fast for someone who'd been working all night. He dropped a coin on her pot's rim that was worth considerably more than the information and kept walking. He found the first trace of her life at the end of the second lane. A girl, maybe 12, sitting on a step with a bandaged arm, not crying but holding the arm the careful way of someone who'd recently been told how to hold it. She looked up when Kaelor stopped. "The woman who wrapped your arm," he said, making his voice flat and non-threatening. "She came through here." The girl's eyes went cautious. "She told me to keep it dry." "I know. Which way did she go?" The girl pointed down the lane without answering, the way children did when they decided to be helpful but not friendly. He went. What he found over the next half hour was not a trail of flight, but a trail of a life being lived at a particular frequency. The kind of frequency he'd never had the occasion to notice before because it operated in registers that didn't intersect with his world. A boy who pointed west because she'd found him a blanket last winter. A man who pointed southwest because she'd sat with his wife through a labor that the court midwives had refused to attend. Two children together who both pointed the same direction and then went back to their quiet game without explanation, as though showing the way for her was something they did without thinking, something that had become reflex. He stopped at the fourth one, an older man outside a doorway, smoking something that smelled like dried bark, who watched Kaelor approach with eyes that had been in a lot of rooms with a lot of dangerous men and had stopped being surprised by any of it. "The healer," Kaelor said. "I know who you mean," the man said. "Which way?" The man took a slow draw, let the smoke out, looked at Kaelor the way someone looked at a thing they were deciding whether to be honest about. "She helped my son," the man said. "2 winters back, something in his lungs. The court physicians wanted payment up front. She took nothing." Kaelor waited. "She's a good woman," the man said, and the inflection on good was carrying something heavier than the word itself. A warning, maybe, or a statement of values that was also a question about his. "I know," Kaelor said. The man studied him for another few seconds and then pointed down the far lane toward the southeastern exit of the quarter. Kaelor had covered 50 yards before it landed on him, fully and without warning, what the man's pointing finger had just handed him. Not the direction, the accumulation. The boy with the blanket, the woman in labor, the children who pointed without thinking, the man with the sick son. An entire quarter of people who knew which way she'd gone because they carried her in their accounting of the world, in their personal record of who had shown up when it mattered. She'd built something here, not a practice, not a business, something more like a web of small accountabilities, person by person, winter by winter. The kind of thing that didn't look like power from the outside, but was the only kind of power that couldn't be revoked by a court order or a title change. He walked faster. He caught up to her at the southeastern gate, not the main gate, but the small one, the one that the refugees used because the guards there had a policy of looking away that had probably started as corruption and become habit. She was talking to the gate guard when he came around the last corner of the lane. Quietly, one hand on the strap of her pack, head tilted in the particular way of someone making a case. The guard was listening with the expression of a man who was inclined to help, but needed the paperwork to be at least technically present. "Seraphina Vale," Kaelor said. He hadn't meant to use her full name. Vane had found it from the merchant Aldous in the 20 minutes Kaelor had been walking, and it had come through via runner just before he'd lost sight of the warehouse, and he'd held it in his mouth for the whole walk through the quarter like something that needed to be placed carefully. She went still. Not the stillness of surprise. The stillness of someone who had already known this was coming and had simply been hoping the timeline would be different. She turned around. In the torchlight of the gate, her face was fully visible for the first time since he'd woken up, and he understood why he hadn't gotten a clear look at it while he was on her examination table. She'd been behind him for most of the work, hands moving, voice coming from somewhere over his shoulder. Now she was facing him, and the gate torch was catching the specific tiredness of someone who'd spent 3 hours pulling old damage out of a stranger's bloodline, and also the specific alertness of someone who had been carrying the mate bond for the last hour and was handling it the way she handled everything, which was apparently by dealing with it and not stopping moving. Her eyes were dark and direct, and she looked at him the way very few people looked at him, without the particular adjustment that happened when people recognized who he was. She didn't know who he was.
That was going to change. "You should be resting," she said. Her voice was level. "I told your commander, small amounts of the compound, not all at once." "I'm fine," he said. "You're upright, which isn't the same as fine. You've been upright for about 3 hours since your body just fought off a partial extraction of a 7-year working. What you should be doing, why did you run?" The question stopped her mid-sentence. She held it for a moment. "I didn't run," she said. "I left. At 2 hours past midnight, without completing the work. I completed enough for tonight. The rest requires—" "Why?" he said again, and this time there was no question shaped to it, just the word, flat and direct and carrying the full weight of what he actually meant, which was both, "Why did you leave?" and "Why did you leave?" knowing what you knew. The gate guard had developed a sudden profound interest in the stone wall to his left. Seraphina shifted the strap on her pack. Looked at him. "Because you needed a healer tonight, and I was one," she said. "That's all it was. That's all I'm able to let it be." "You felt it," he said. Her jaw tightened. "That's not something I'm discussing at a gate." "Then discuss it somewhere else. Come back. Let me—" "No. Clean and final and not loud. I don't go back to powerful men. I don't do it as a policy, and I don't make exceptions for circumstances that feel significant in the moment, because the circumstances always feel significant in the moment, and then the moment changes, and I'm still in the same room." He stood very still and looked at her and felt the full shape of what she'd just said moving through him. "I'm not Malrek Thorn," he said. The reaction was immediate and physical. Her breath changed, her eyes sharpened, and the way she was holding her pack strap shifted from prepared to leave to something tighter. "How do you know that name?" she said. Not a question, a controlled alarm. "My commander is thorough," Kaelor said. "He found out more than your name in the time I was walking here." "Then your commander is too thorough," she said, "and you have your answer about why I don't go back." She turned to the gate guard. Kaelor said, "The working is going to come back." She stopped. "Whatever you cleared tonight," he said, keeping his voice even, "the root is still there. You know that. You said as much to Vane." He watched her spine and the set of her shoulders and didn't look away. "You cleared enough that I'm standing here having this conversation instead of lying on a floor somewhere. But you didn't finish. You know you didn't finish." The gate guard had now found something deeply fascinating about his own boots. "Come back," Kaelor said, "and finish the work. That's all I'm asking." She turned around. The look on her face was the look of someone who had just been handed an argument they couldn't easily counter, and who was angry about it. "That's not all you're asking," she said. "No," he said, "but it's all I'm asking tonight." A long silence. The cold moved through the gate gap. Somewhere in the quarter behind them, a child was crying in the particular distant way of nightmares. "I'll need 3 more sessions," she said finally, and the way she said it made it sound like a legal contract being negotiated with unfavorable terms. "Spaced at least 5 days apart, at my location, on my schedule. You come with 2 men at most, you tell no one else where you're going. Agreed." "And what I know about your health," she said, "stays in this conversation. I don't discuss my patients." "I know that," he said. "You know it now because you've known me for 4 hours," she said. "That's not the same as trusting it." He looked at her for a moment. "Fair," he said. She held his gaze for 2 more seconds, then turned and walked back through the gate guard station and back into the lane without another word. He watched her go, the particular way she moved, the set of her shoulders that said she was always half ready to carry more than she was carrying. The gate guard cleared his throat. Kaelor turned and walked back toward the warehouse. The bond was a direction, and the direction was still west, and he let himself feel it for the length of the walk back, without doing anything about it. He'd been a man who moved toward what he wanted his entire life, and had never once considered that the movement itself might need to look different depending on the territory. He was considering it now. Sad. Vane was waiting inside the warehouse with the particular expression of a man who had been waiting in a grain warehouse at 2 hours past midnight and was committed to not complaining about it. "She's coming back," Kaelor said. 3 more sessions." "Good," Vane said. "The First Lord Thorn moves on her. Kaelor said, pulling the borrowed cloak off and dropping it over the table. I want to know about it before it happens. Vane's eyes sharpened. You think he's watching her? I think Lord Thorn watches everything that was ever his, Kaelor said. And I think the moment he learns she put her hands on the Alpha King's bloodline, he'll reframe her as a political asset he neglected to properly secure. He picked up the compound she'd left and turned it in his hands. The smell of it reached him again, that sharp green medicinal thing that had apparently decided to live in his senses permanently. Have a man in the quarter, quiet, not interfering, just watching the approaches. And if Thorn moves, Kaelor set the compound down. Then we'll have a conversation about Lord Thorn's ambitions that we should probably have had some time ago regardless. He moved to the door and paused with his hand on the frame, looking out at the dark of the quarter. Somewhere west, she was walking back to whatever space she'd made for herself in the middle of all this wreckage, the children and the old men and the small web of accountabilities she'd built person by person in the cold. He'd spent 20 years building an empire. He'd built it the way empires got built, which was by being harder and more ruthless than everything that came against it, by making the cost of resistance clear and immediate and personal. He understood for the first time, standing at the door of a grain warehouse with the mate bond sitting in his chest like a coal he hadn't asked for, that there were kinds of building he hadn't tried yet. He filed that thought, walked back to the palace through the dark. 3 days later, Lord Malrek Thorn received a piece of information that cost him a considerable sum and came from a source inside the Caldrath Merchant Guild, and he sat with it for the better part of an evening in his private study before he understood its full shape. The Alpha King had been seen in the refugee quarter, not in his capacity as king, alone, or nearly. One companion, dark clothes, no banners. Thorn sat back in his chair and thought about his former mate, and the very particular skill set she possessed, and the fact that the Alpha King had been, by reliable court account, suffering episodes of increasing severity that court physicians had been unable to address. He thought about the mate bond, and the way it worked, and the window of vulnerability it represented. He picked up his pen. The letter he began to write was addressed to 3 lords of the Imperial Council, men who had their own reasons for watching the Alpha King's health with something more active than concern. The letter did not commit him to anything specific. It simply raised questions about the nature of the king's condition, about who might have been treating it outside official channels, about whether an unlicensed healer in the refugee quarter who happened to be the former mate of a well-placed lord might constitute a security concern worth examining. He wrote carefully. He was always careful. When he sealed it, he held the seal in the wax for a moment longer than necessary, pressing down until the impression was clean and deep and permanent. Somewhere in the city, Seraphina Vale was walking through her morning without knowing that her name was being written in a letter that would reach the Imperial Council in 3 days and change the shape of everything that came after. She had saved the life of the most powerful man in Varethis. She had run from the consequence of that. The consequence was now running toward her. The second session happened 5 days after the first, and the third 8 days after that. And by the time Seraphina was preparing for the fourth, she had developed the particular problem of knowing a person too well for the distance she was trying to maintain between them. She knew the sound his breathing made when she touched the deepest thread of the working, the specific catch that he never let become audible but that existed in the half-second before he controlled it. She knew he arrived exactly on time, never early, which was its own kind of message about the effort he spent on appearing like a man who had nowhere more important to be. She knew he watched her hands when she worked, and that he didn't do it the way patients usually watched, with anxiety about what the hands were finding. He watched them the way someone watched a thing they were trying to understand. She knew she was in trouble. She had known it since the second session and had kept working anyway because the alternative was leaving the root untouched, and that was not something her hands would agree to. The fourth session was supposed to be the last. She'd cleared enough in the third that what remained was surface work, stabilization, the kind of finishing that required precision more than depth. She had told herself this meant it was almost over. She had told herself a number of things over the past 3 weeks that her body had declined to agree with. He arrived at the warehouse as the evening settled into full dark. Vane at his shoulder as always, and she opened the door and they went through the now established routine of it. pack hung on the left peg, compound set on the shelf corner, the specific way he sat on the edge of the table and looked at the wall while she assessed his pulse first to understand where the working was sitting tonight. "It's quieter," she said. "I know," he said. "I can feel the difference." She moved behind him and placed her hands and found the working reduced to something that barely registered against the clean vitality underneath. And the clean vitality underneath was substantial. She understood, touching it now after weeks of clearing away what had been laid over it, what he had been before the working took hold, what he still was, under 7 years of damage. It was a significant thing to be allowed to know about a person. "This is the last session," she said. "Yes. After tonight, the working will be residual. It won't progress. Your body will handle the rest." "I know." A pause. "You told me that last time. I'm telling you again so we're clear about what tonight is." He was quiet for a moment and then he said, without changing his tone at all, "I found out 3 days ago who helped the merchant Aldous make the initial contact, who the third party was." Her hands stilled. "It wasn't someone random," he said. "It was someone I sent, someone I tasked with finding options 8 months ago before things got significantly worse. Someone who found your name in a refugee account and held on to it." He paused. "I'd been told about you before that night, not in any detail, but enough that the decision to come here wasn't as blind as I let you believe." She kept her hands where they were and breathed through the thing that moved through her chest. Not quite betrayal, not quite the shock of it, but the particular feeling of discovering that a story you thought you understood had different edges than you'd mapped. "Why are you telling me this now?" she said. "Because you're almost done," he said, "and I don't want you to find out after." She let the silence sit. "You could have told me the first night," she said. "You would have left." "Yes," she said, "I would have." "I know." Another pause. "I'm not apologizing for it. I needed the help. You were the help. But I'm telling you now because—" He stopped. "Because you should have accurate information about the situation you're in." She took her hands away from his back and came around to the side of the table and looked at him directly. "What does that mean?" she said. "The situation I'm in." His jaw was set in the particular way that meant he was about to say something he'd weighed carefully and had decided to say anyway. "Thorn knows you've been treating me. He moved on the information 12 days ago. I've been managing the fallout, but the Imperial Council has questions that are—" He met her eyes, getting harder to answer at a distance. The cold came in through the window gap, and she stood there and felt it. 12 days, she said. "Yes. You've known for 12 days that I was exposed and you continued to come here. I had men watching the approaches. Nothing was going to reach you." "That's not the point," she said, and her voice came out with an edge in it that she didn't try to smooth down. "The point is that you made a decision that affected my safety, and you made it without telling me. That is precisely the kind of decision that—" She stopped, controlled herself. "That is the specific thing I left Thorn over. Not the danger. The deciding for me without asking." The silence that followed was different from the other silences between them, heavier. "You're right," he said. She had not expected that. "You're right," he said again, as if saying it twice was the way he processed the unfamiliar texture of it. "I rationalized it as protection. It was control. There isn't a useful difference between those two things from where you're standing." She looked at him for a long time. Outside, somewhere in the quarter, the night sounds were settling into their familiar pattern, and she was standing in her own workroom at the end of the last session, with the truth of the last 3 weeks reconfiguring itself around this new information. "Finish the work," he said quietly. "And then I need to tell you what we're going to do about Thorn, because it requires your understanding of the situation, not just my management of it. You deserve to have the information." She stood there. Then she moved back behind him and placed her hands and finished the work. She was still in the workroom 2 hours later when Vane came through the door without knocking, which was the first signal that something had changed, because Vane always knocked. The second signal was his face. "There are men at the north end of the quarter," he said. His voice had the flat tone of someone delivering information fast. "Council Guard livery. 8 of them. They're asking for the healer. Seraphina set down the cloth she was holding. Kaelor was on his feet before Vane finished the sentence, and the thing that happened to his face in that moment was something she had not seen in 3 weeks of sessions. Not the controlled man, not the one who chose his words carefully and admitted fault when it was precise to do so. Something older and harder than all of that, the thing underneath the choice and the control. "How long?" he said. 15 minutes before they reached the street. Kaelor turned to Seraphina. "Pack what you need. Now. You're not staying here tonight." "They're council guard," she said. "If I run from council guard, it becomes worse," he said. "Yes. But right now I don't have the position to stop this through official channels. And if they take you into council custody, I can't get you out without making the situation public in a way that burns every remaining option." He crossed the room and picked up her cloak from the peg and held it out to her. "Pack. 10 minutes. We're going." She took the cloak. She packed. She moved through the workroom with the particular efficiency of someone who had already planned an emergency exit that they hoped never to use, because she had in fact planned exactly that, had planned it when she first settled into this warehouse, and had updated it every few months the way she updated her compound stores and her patient list. She took the compounds she couldn't replace, the documents she couldn't reconstruct, the small locked box from behind the third barrel that held what remained of her practical resources. She took the record she kept of patients, not the names she kept in her head, but the treatment notes, the compounds that had worked and the ones that hadn't, the accumulated learning of 6 years of unlicensed practice in the margins of an empire that had never made space for her. She had 10 minutes, and she used 9 of them. They moved through the back of the quarter on a route that Kaelor clearly hadn't planned, but was navigating with the particular confidence of someone who processed spatial information fast and made decisions in it without second-guessing. Vane was 30 feet behind them, watching the rear approaches. "Where are we going?" she said. "The Eastern Garrison," he said. "There's a holding house attached to it, safe, defensible, and under my direct authority rather than the Council's." "If I go under your direct authority," she said, keeping pace with him, "then everything Thorn wrote in that letter becomes true. I'm a woman under the Alpha King's protection. The implication—" "I know what the implication is." "Then you understand that it doesn't help me." He moved through a narrow gap between buildings, and she followed him, and they came out on a broader lane, and he stopped and turned and faced her, and the lamplight from the building across the way caught the full expression on his face for the first time since they'd left the workroom. "I know," he said. "I know it doesn't help you, and I know that everything I'm doing right now is another version of the same thing you were describing an hour ago, moving you without asking." Something tightened in his jaw. "But the garrison is the only place tonight where I can guarantee nothing happens to you before I can address this properly. That's the honest situation. I'm telling you the honest situation." She stood on the lane in the cold and looked at him, and thought about the specific question of whether a man's honesty about his own coercion made the coercion different. She had spent 2 years learning that it didn't with Thorn. She had learned it in increments, each one reasonable on its own. This felt different. She didn't entirely trust that it felt different. 5 days, she said. "I'll stay 5 days. In that time you address this through official channels, or I leave and take my chances with the council guard directly." "That's—" He stopped. "Yes, 5 days." They moved. The Imperial Council chamber smelled like old stone and ambition, and Lord Malrek Thorn stood before it the following afternoon with the particular posture of a man who had rehearsed his position and was satisfied with how it presented. He had not expected the king to be there. Kaelor sat at the head of the chamber table in full formal dress, which meant he'd made the decision to escalate this to an official proceeding and had done it between last night and this morning, which meant he'd been moving faster than Thorn had estimated. A minor recalibration. "Lord Thorn," Kaelor said. "My king." The bow was precise and offered nothing extra. "Your letter to Lords Craven, Harwick, and Belmar raises a number of questions," Kaelor said. "I thought we might address them directly." "I wrote in the interest of Imperial security," Thorn said. "A healer of unknown credential and unlicensed practice has been given access to the person of the Alpha King. The Council has a legitimate—"
She saved my life, Kaelor said. The chamber went quiet. The condition I've been carrying for 7 years, Kaelor said, and his voice was perfectly level, which was the most dangerous register it had, has been significantly addressed by her treatment. The court physicians had 4 years to find that result and did not find it. She found it in 4 sessions. He looked at Thorn without any readable expression. Your concern for my health is noted. Is there a specific charge you'd like to bring? Thorn held the pause for exactly the right length of time. There are questions, he said carefully, about the nature of the bond that may have formed between the healer and the king during treatment. Questions about whether that bond constitutes a form of influence over imperial decision-making that the council has a right to. Her name, Kaelor said, is Seraphina Vale. And I'll save you the careful language, Malrek. Yes, there is a mate bond. Yes, it formed during treatment. No, it does not constitute manipulation, because the bond is not something either party manufactures or controls, as you are well aware, having held one yourself. The temperature in the chamber dropped by several degrees. Thorn's jaw tightened. My former bond is not relevant to... Your former bond to the woman who is now the subject of this conversation, Kaelor said, is entirely relevant, because what you're doing in this chamber has nothing to do with imperial security and everything to do with the specific nature of a man who cannot accept that something he considered his has chosen a different direction. Several things happened simultaneously in the chamber. 3 of the seated lords shifted in their chairs. One of Thorn's allies on the left end of the table made a small controlled movement toward the documents in front of him. Thorn himself went very still in the particular way of a man managing a response that, if released, would damage him. The council will decide, Thorn said quietly, whether the Alpha King's judgment has been compromised by a bond he did not choose and cannot objectively assess. The council can try, Kaelor said. The Imperial Charter, Article 9, Thorn said, and now the careful voice was gone, and something flat and hard had taken its place. Grants the council authority to call a fitness review if 3 or more members have documented cause to believe the Alpha King is operating under undue. You don't have 3 members. I have 4, Thorn said. As of this morning. The silence in the chamber was the specific silence of a trap closing. Kaelor sat very still. He had built this empire stone by stone across 20 years of decisions that other men lacked the will to make. He had walked into rooms where the outcome was uncertain, and he had bent the outcome by force of character and strategic position and the willingness to pay whatever cost the room was charging. He had never once sat at a table where the mathematics were this clean and this bad. 4 lords was a majority. A fitness review meant a formal suspension of executive authority pending council investigation. It meant his decisions could be overruled. It meant Seraphina became a matter of public record rather than a private situation. And every protection he'd built around her in the last 5 days became dependent on the goodwill of men who currently wanted him vulnerable. He understood in that moment, sitting at the head of a table he'd sat at for 15 years, that the empire he had built with the specific tools of dominance and strategic brutality had just turned those same tools against him, in the hands of men he had taught how to use them. Thorn looked at him across the table with the expression of a man who had waited a long time to be in this room with this particular arrangement of forces. Surrender the Omega, Thorn said quietly. Formally dissolve whatever claim you've made. She returns to my custody as my former bonded, which is her legal standing under imperial law, and this conversation ends here. She is not property, Kaelor said. The law, Thorn said, disagrees. Kaelor looked at him for a long moment. Then he looked at the 4 lords along the table who had signed whatever document Thorn had put in front of them this morning. Men he had appointed, men whose territories existed in their current form because of decisions he had made. He stood up. You'll have my response in 48 hours, he said. He walked out of the chamber and the door closed behind him, and he stood in the corridor outside it with Vane at his shoulder, and 48 hours between him and a choice that the architecture of his entire reign had made impossible. He could surrender Seraphina. The law supported it. The council would stand down. Thorn would take her back into the specific kind of custody that the law called protection, and she knew was a cage, and the empire would continue under his rule for however many years remained in it, and he would spend every one of them knowing exactly what he'd chosen and exactly what it had cost. Or he could fight, but fighting meant burning resources he didn't have, on ground Thorn had chosen, with the mate bond being used as the primary evidence of his own incapacity. It meant the woman he was fighting for becoming the public face of a civil crisis she had never asked to be part of. It meant everything he'd spent 20 years building becoming the mechanism by which she was destroyed. He stood in the corridor and breathed. He had 48 hours to find a third option that the room he'd just left had been specifically designed to make impossible. And somewhere in the eastern garrison, Seraphina Vale was waiting on the 5 days he'd promised her, not knowing that the ground under both of them had just shifted in a way that made the original terms of that promise meaningless. He started walking. He needed her to know, not because telling her would help the situation, not because she could change the mathematics, because she deserved to have the accurate information about the situation she was in. He told her that himself. He told her everything. Not the managed version, not the version shaped for tactical effect, all of it, standing in the bare room of the eastern garrison holding house with the lamp burning low between them and 47 hours left on the clock Thorn had started. She listened without moving. When he finished, she was quiet for a long time, the specific quiet of someone processing information that changes the geometry of everything they thought they understood about the ground they were standing on. "Surrender me," she said finally. "No." Kaelor. The name came out flat and direct, and it was the first time she had used it. He felt it land somewhere specific. "Listen to what I'm saying. If the choice is between your empire and whatever this is between us, the empire doesn't end when you surrender me. I end. Those are different scales. I know what the scales are. Then act like it." "I am acting like it," he said. "I've been acting like it for 20 years, and what I built is being used tonight by a man who knows exactly which lever to pull because I built the lever and showed him where it was." He moved to the window and looked out at the garrison yard below, the night watch moving in their patterns, the Empire's machinery continuing in its indifferent way regardless of what was happening in this room. "If I surrender you, he wins, not the council, him. And the next person he does this to won't have anyone in the room with the authority to push back." She was quiet again. "That's a principle," she said carefully. "It's a good principle. I'm asking whether it's the real reason." He turned from the window. "No," he said. "It isn't the only reason." She held his gaze for a long moment and nodded once, not like someone receiving good news, like someone confirming a fact they needed confirmed before they could move forward. "Then what's the third option?" she said. "The Blood Moon Assembly," he said. "It convenes in 4 days. Full Imperial Council, all territorial lords, every faction withstanding in Verithus. Under Assembly rules, no fitness review can be enacted while a formal Assembly is in session. It gives me a floor to address the bond question publicly, on my terms, with witnesses Thorn can't control." 4 days, she said. 3, now. And between now and then. "Between now and then," he said, "I need to get through whatever Thorn decides to do when his 48 hours expire without a surrender." She looked at him. "He'll move on the palace," she said. It wasn't a question. "He has 4 lords. Between them, they have enough private garrison strength to force the issue if they move together before I can get to the assembly floor." He watched her process this. "I have the Imperial Guard. I have Vane. I have the loyalty of most of the territorial commanders, but loyalty at a distance takes time to activate. The gap between what I have tonight and what I need tonight is significant." The lamp guttered. The cold from the window pressed in. "Tell me what to do," she said. He looked at her. "I need you to stay in this building," he said. "I need you to stay visible to the garrison command so there's no question about your status or location. And I need you to trust that what I'm moving is moving in your direction." She held his gaze for a long time. "I've stayed in buildings before," she said, "because powerful men told me it was for my protection." "I know. And I'm aware this is different. I'm aware you've told me things Thorn never told me, that you've said the words and meant them." She stopped. "I'm telling you that awareness and trust are not the same thing yet. You understand that?" "Yes,"
he said. I'll stay, she said. 3 days, not because I trust the situation, because the assembly floor is the right place to end this, and running before we get there helps no one. She picked up the lamp and moved toward the inner room. Go do what you need to do. Come back alive. She said the last 3 words without turning around, and they landed in the room like something she hadn't planned to say out loud. He went. Costs. The first attack came 18 hours later. Not on the garrison. Thorn was smarter than a frontal assault on Imperial property in daylight. It came through channels, the kind of attack that looked like paperwork and procedure, but had the same intent as a blade. A council writ delivered to the garrison commander at dawn by a junior clerk with the seals of 4 lords attached, ordering the formal detainment of one Seraphina Vale pending investigation under Article 14 of the Imperial Compact, which covered foreign agents and undocumented practitioners operating within the capital boundaries. Kaelor was in the war room when the runner brought word of it. He read it once and handed it back. Reject it, he said. My king, 4 lords, have the authority to request detainment. They do not have the authority to execute it inside an active Imperial garrison without the commanding officer's consent. Commander Reth knows the distinction. He looked at the runner. Tell him I said so. The runner went. Kaelor turned back to the map on the table where Vane was standing with the particular expression of someone calculating forces against time. They're testing the garrison's loyalty, Vane said. That writ was never going to succeed. They wanted to know if Reth would fold. He won't, Kaelor said. You're certain? Reth has been garrison commander for 11 years. He's watched the council play this game from the inside long enough to know which way he stands when the room divides. He moved a marker on the map. The real move is tonight. Thorn won't waste 3 days on paperwork once he knows the garrison is solid. He'll go for something that forces my hand before the assembly convenes. The palace, Vane said. The moon chamber specifically. The assembly convenes there. If he controls the physical space before the session opens, he controls who gets a floor and what the agenda carries. Kaelor looked at the map. I want 2 additional units on the palace perimeter starting at sunset. Quietly. No banners, no announcement. If Thorn's people are watching, and they are, I want them to have to decide whether to move before they're ready. And if they decide to move anyway, then we find out what we're actually made of, Kaelor said. But they moved at 2 hours past midnight. Not Thorn's private garrison. He was too careful for that kind of direct commitment. What came over the northern palace wall was a mixed force wearing unmarked leathers, the specific kind of unmarked that had been purchased rather than standard issued, the kind that could be credibly denied as a rogue element if the move failed. 40 men over the wall. Another 20 at the eastern servant entrance with forged credentials that got them through 2 checkpoints before the 3rd guard recognized something was wrong and raised the alarm. Kaelor was awake. He had not slept. He'd been in the command position at the base of the moon chamber tower since midnight, Vane beside him, the Imperial Guard deployed in the 3 positions that covered the most likely approaches based on the garrison reports from the previous 6 hours of watching Thorn's logistics move. When the alarm sounded, he was already moving. The fight in the northern corridor was close and brutal and entirely without the architecture of formal battle. No formations, no clear lines, just men in a burning hallway trying to get past each other in opposite directions. Kaelor moved through it the way he'd moved through 20 years of empire building, not by being the most skilled fighter in the room, though he was, but by being the one whose commitment to the outcome was of a different quality than the men opposing him. The men opposing him were hired. They were professional and capable, and they were doing a job for payment. He was fighting for something that didn't have a price, and the difference between those 2 things was legible in the way he moved, in the decisions he made in the half-second windows that combat provided. He took a cut across the left forearm in the 2nd minute, didn't stop. Took an elbow to the jaw in the 5th minute that rattled his vision sideways for a single beat before he locked it back down and kept going. The pain was information, and he processed it, and he moved. The northern corridor cleared in 8 minutes. The eastern approach was worse. The men who'd come through the servant entrance had used the time while the northern fight pulled attention to move deeper into the palace, toward the moon chamber itself, and Vane's unit had met them halfway down the Great Hall in a collision that was still unresolved when Kaelor arrived with the northern corridor clear. He came in from behind Vane's position and hit the flank of the forward group, and the math changed. The moon chamber was secured 11 minutes later. 3 of Kaelor's Imperial Guard were down. Not dead. 2 were on their feet inside of a minute. 1 needed carrying. 7 of the attacking force were incapacitated in the hall. The rest had withdrawn through the servant entrance when the flank broke. Vane was bleeding from his shoulder, pressing a folded cloth against it with the methodical focus of a man who had taken worse and was not currently interested in discussing it. "The assembly floor is secure," Kaelor said. "For tonight," Vane said. "For tonight is enough." He stood in the moon chamber and looked at the space, the high vaulted ceiling, the tiered seating that held the council and the lords during formal sessions, the central floor where the Alpha King traditionally stood to address the full assembly. He had stood in this room 100 times, and it had always been his. He had never once considered what it would look like from the outside. From the position of someone who had no standing here, no title, no protection beyond what one person's decision could provide or revoke. Seraphina had lived her entire life in that position. He understood something in that moment that he could not have understood from the other side of the room. What it cost to operate in a world where your safety was always someone else's decision. What it required of a person to keep functioning, keep building, keep offering their hands to strangers who needed them, inside a system that had never once offered them the same. She hadn't survived Thorn by becoming harder. She'd survived by becoming more precise about where she put her trust and more rigorous about the distinction between what people said and what they actually did when it cost them something to do it. He looked at the blood on his forearm and decided something without naming it out loud. Dawn came gray and cold over the capital. The Blood Moon Assembly convened at the second hour after sunrise, and every seat in the moon chamber was filled, which meant word had moved through the night the way word moved in capital cities. By the specific network of people who understood that when the Alpha King's Guard fought an unmarked force in the palace halls before a formal assembly, the assembly itself was going to be worth attending. Kaelor stood on the central floor in full formal dress, the cut on his forearm wrapped and invisible under his sleeve, his face carrying the specific expression of a man who had decided how this day was going to go and was not interested in alternative proposals. Thorn sat in the third tier. His 4 lords were arrayed around him. His face was composed and watchful and giving nothing. The assembly opened with the standard proceedings, and Kaelor let them run for exactly the time required by protocol, and then he stepped forward. "I'm going to address the question that's actually in this room," he said, "instead of the one on the agenda." The chamber went quiet. "Lord Thorn has brought before this council the question of whether an Alpha King who has formed a mate bond is capable of objective imperial governance." He looked across the assembled lords. "I'm going to answer that question directly, and then I'm going to ask this assembly a different question in return." He had the floor. He had always been able to hold a room. It was one of the things that had built the empire, the ability to stand in a space full of men who wanted something different and make them listen anyway. "The bond exists," he said. "I won't deny it, and I won't apologize for it. What I will tell you is that the woman who carries the other end of it saved my life when this empire was 6 months away from the question of succession. She did it as an unlicensed healer in a refugee quarter, taking nothing, asking nothing, without knowing who I was. And when she found out the situation she was in, she stayed anyway. Not because she was ordered to, not because the law required it, but because she made a choice." He looked at Thorn. "Lord Thorn's argument is that this bond compromises my judgment. I'm putting before this assembly a counter-argument, that a man whose judgment has been sharpened by proximity to genuine courage, the kind that doesn't require a title or a garrison or a seat in this chamber, is more capable of imperial governance, not less." Thorn stood. "The charter," he began. "I'm not finished," Kaelor said. The room held. "Article 9 gives the council authority to review an Alpha King's fitness," Kaelor said. "It does not give Lord Thorn the authority to send unmarked forces into this palace during the night before a formal assembly. It does not give him the authority to file detainment writs targeting a woman under imperial garrison protection. And it does not,
give him the authority to reframe his personal grievance as imperial policy. Thorn's jaw was tight. "You want a review?" Kaelor said. "Fine. Call the vote. Right now, in this room, with every lord who has a stake in how this empire runs. Let's find out where the room actually stands." A long silence moved through the chamber. Then one of Thorn's 4 lords, the one on the far left, the one Kaelor had been watching since the session opened, looked down at the table in front of him. It was a small movement, the kind that meant he was deciding something. Thorn saw it too, and in the specific second that followed, in the gap between Thorn seeing his coalition fracture and calculating how to respond, Kaelor watched the man's composure do something he had never seen it do in 15 years of sharing a council chamber. It cracked, not wide open, a hairline fracture, the kind that was invisible to anyone who hadn't been watching the exact right place at the exact right moment. But Kaelor had been watching. "Lord Harwick," Thorn said, and his voice had dropped to something low and cold and very controlled. "We discussed this." "We discussed a great many things," Harwick said, not looking up from the table, "that were framed somewhat differently than how they appear in this chamber." The crack spread. Thorn turned from Harwick and looked at Kaelor across the floor, and in the look was the specific intelligence of a man who understood the position had shifted and was already moving to the next calculation. "This isn't over," Thorn said. "No," Kaelor said. "It isn't." Thorn moved. Not out through the main chamber doors, down through the tier stairs fast, his remaining 3 lords moving behind him, and the direction he was heading was toward the lower palace access, toward the garrison corridors that connected the moon chamber to the eastern holding section, toward where Seraphina was. Kaelor was off the floor before anyone in the chamber had processed what was happening. "Vane," he said, not loudly, and Vane was already moving from his position at the chamber wall.
They came down the tier stairs 3 at a time and hit the lower corridor at a run, and Kaelor moved through the palace the way he'd moved through the northern corridor last night. Not with the architecture of formal authority, but with the specific velocity of a man who had decided there was nothing between him and the thing he was moving toward. The eastern garrison corridor was 200 yards and 2 locked doors and 1 guard rotation. He covered it in less than 2 minutes. He heard Seraphina's voice before he reached the holding house door. Not scared, controlled. The specific controlled tone of someone managing a confrontation they hadn't chosen and were not going to lose. "You have no authority in this section," she was saying. "This is Imperial garrison space." "My dear," Thorn's voice smooth and cold as river ice, "you were always going to end up back in this conversation." Kaelor hit the door. It opened. Thorn was standing 6 feet from Seraphina with 2 of his lords bracketing the doorway behind him. Seraphina was standing against the far wall with her pack on the floor, at her feet and both hands visible at her sides, and the expression on her face was the specific expression of someone who had decided 3 seconds ago that they were not running. Thorn turned when the door opened. For 1 flat second, the 4 of them, Kaelor, Thorn, Seraphina, Vane in the doorway behind, held the geometry of the room. "Step away from her," Kaelor said. "We're having a conversation," Thorn said. "Step away from her." Thorn looked at him, and the smooth composure was back in place, reassembled quickly and well, and his voice came out with the specific texture of a man laying down a final card. "Kill him," Thorn said. Both lords in the doorway moved at the same instant, and Vane took the first one off his feet before he'd covered a yard. And the second came past Vane fast and low, with a blade already drawn, and Kaelor met him in the center of the room, and the fight that followed was ugly and short, in very close quarters. Kaelor took the blade across his side. Not deep. He'd turned into it rather than away, which was a decision his body made before his mind caught up. The kind of instinct that 20 years of combat built into the bone, but deep enough. He felt it as a line of cold fire, and then as the specific wet heat of blood moving into his shirt, and he kept both hands on the man's weapon arm until the man was down and the blade was in his own hand, and then he straightened up. Thorn was at the far side of the room. Seraphina was not where she'd been standing. She had moved. Not away, not toward the door. She'd moved to the side of the room near the supply shelf, and in her hand was a length of iron pipe from the repair tools stacked against the wall, and she was standing between Thorn and the door with the specific look of someone who had run out of patience entirely. "Seraphina," Thorn said, and for the first time in 15 years of Kaelor watching the man operate, there was something underneath the composure that sounded almost human. "Don't." "Get out," she said. "You don't have— Get out of this room," she said, "or I will put this through your knee and deal with the consequences." The silence in the room had the specific quality of a thing balanced on an edge. Kaelor was bleeding. He could feel it, not a dramatic amount, but a consistent one, the kind that meant the cut needed attention in the next 20 minutes and not the next hour. He held Thorn's blade and watched Seraphina Vale stand between the most politically dangerous man in Varithus and the only exit, and something moved through him that he had no existing vocabulary for. Thorn looked from her to Kaelor, looked at the blade in Kaelor's hand, looked at Vayne in the doorway with the first of his lords still on the floor. He made a calculation. "This isn't the end," he said. "No," Kaelor said, "but it's close." Thorn walked to the door. Vayne let him through. The last lord followed. The room went quiet. Seraphina lowered the pipe. She looked at Kaelor, and her eyes went immediately to his side, and the expression on her face moved through several things in quick succession before it settled into something that looked a great deal like fury. "You're bleeding," she said. "I'm aware. Sit down." "Thorn is— Sit down," she said, and the voice she used was the one from the examination table, the one that was not making a request, and he sat. She crossed the room and pulled his shirt aside and looked at the cut with the focused assessment of someone who had seen wounds every day for 6 years and was categorizing this one in real time. "It needs closing," she said. "It's not going to kill you tonight." "Good," he said. She was already moving to her pack, pulling out what she needed, hands moving through the familiar sequence. He watched her work and breathed through the specific pain of a cut that hadn't been treated yet, and understood that he was sitting in a garrison holding house bleeding onto the floor, while the assembly above them resolved itself into whatever it was going to resolve into, and he was not in any hurry to go back up there. "You held your ground," he said. "I've been holding my ground since I was 20 years old," she said. "I'm tired of it being remarkable." She pressed a cloth to the cut, and he absorbed the sharp, specific pressure of it without moving. "After today," he said carefully, "it shouldn't have to be." She looked up at him. The lamp in the room was the same quality of light as the warehouse had been on the first night, and her face in it was the same combination of exhaustion and precision and something underneath both of those things that she hadn't chosen to show him yet, but that the bond meant he could feel anyway. The particular temperature of someone who had been alone in their own decisions for a very long time and was in the process of deciding whether that was still what they wanted. "Kaelor," she said. "Yes." "If you survive the next hour," she said, pressing down on the cloth and watching his face for the response and not giving any ground when he didn't react, "we're going to have a very long conversation about the nature of what you just promised." "I know," he said, "and I'm going to hold you to every word of it." "I know that too." She held his gaze for one long moment. Then she went back to the cut with both hands and the focused calm of someone who had work to do and was doing it. And above them in the moon chamber of the Varithus imperial palace, the vote that would determine the shape of everything after was moving toward a number, and the empire was waiting to find out what kind of man its king intended to be when the room stopped burning. The vote came back in 20 minutes. Vayne brought the count down to the holding house himself, which meant he'd stood in the moon chamber and watched it happen in person and wanted to deliver it with his own voice rather than through a runner. Kaelor was still sitting on the edge of the cot with Seraphina's stitchwork closed under fresh linen when the door opened. 14 for the review, Vayne said. 22 against. Kaelor let the number settle. Harwick, he said. Harwick, Belmar, and 2 others who apparently decided overnight that Lord Thorn's coalition was less stable than initially advertised. Vayne's expression held the careful neutrality of a man who had strong feelings about the outcome and was restraining them on professional grounds. Thorn left the assembly floor before the count was announced. His personal garrison at the eastern estate has been standing down since mid-morning. Kaelor looked at the wrapped cut on his side, at Seraphina's hand still holding the last of the linen. "Where's he now?" Kaelor said. "Riding for his northern territory," Vayne said. "Fast," The silence in the room held for a moment. "Let him go," Kaelor said. Vane's eyes moved briefly to Seraphina and back. "My king, the attack on the palace last night constitutes grounds for—" "I know what it constitutes. Let him go." He looked at Vane directly. "This empire has spent 20 years making examples. I want to try something different and see what it produces." Vane held his gaze for a long moment. "Understood," he said, and left. Seraphina set down the last of the linen and washed her hands in the basin on the side table and dried them with the specific careful attention of someone who treated her hands as working tools. She didn't say anything. He watched her do it and understood that she was giving him space to finish landing in what had just happened, the way she'd learned over 4 sessions to read what he needed before he asked for it. "It's over," he said. "The assembly vote is over," she said. "Nothing else is over yet." He looked at her. "No," he said. "Not yet." They gave him 3 days before the Empire needed him back. 3 days was not a long time, but it was more than he'd had to himself in 20 years of running a country, and he used the first one to sleep in a way he hadn't slept since before the working took hold. Deep and uninterrupted and without the half-vigilance that had become so habitual, he'd stopped recognizing it as vigilance and started calling it normal. He woke up in the afternoon of the first day and lay still for a long time, looking at the ceiling of his own chamber and doing something that was not quite thinking, something closer to accounting, the kind that happened when the emergency ended and the room went quiet and there was nothing left to move toward, and the space that created was suddenly full of everything you hadn't had time to look at directly. 7 years of the working, 7 years of managing a slow erosion of the thing that made him who he was, the deep vital current that every decision he'd made drew on, and managing it alone, and building the management of it into the way he moved through every room so completely that no one who watched him could see the cost. He thought about the first night in the warehouse, and the specific quality of the silence after the working's pressure released, the silence that had no word in the language of men who'd only ever known its absence. He thought about the 4 lords, about Thorn's face in the holding house when Seraphina had put herself between him and the door with a length of pipe, about the hairline fracture in Thorn's composure when Harwick looked away. He thought about what he'd said to Vane in the moon chamber corridor when Thorn moved, not the strategic calculation, not the imperial authority, the thing underneath all of it that had moved his feet before his mind caught up. He had built an empire on the premise that enough force applied with enough intelligence could move anything. He had been right about that for 20 years. He had been wrong about what it built in the long run, the specific thing it built in the men around him, and in himself, and in the empire's understanding of what the man at the top of it was actually for. He got up, washed, dressed without calling anyone to help him, which was apparently unusual enough that the guard outside his door looked briefly startled. He went to find Seraphina. She was in the garden that ran along the eastern wall of the palace, the one nobody used in winter because it was exposed and cold, and the decorative plants were all dead until spring. She was sitting on a stone bench with her hands around a clay cup of something hot, looking at the bare branches of the trees along the wall, and she looked up when she heard him on the path. She looked rested. Not fully. The specific tiredness of weeks didn't clear in 3 days. But the particular edge of vigilance that had been in her face since he'd found her at the gate was gone. She looked like herself, which he realized was a distinction he could now make. He sat on the other end of the bench. For a few minutes, neither of them said anything. The cold was clean and the garden was bare and the sky above the wall was the specific white gray of winter settling in, and it was a strange place to feel, for the first time in a long time, like the space around him was not requiring anything of him. "I need to ask you something," he said. "Ask." "The first night, after the working, you felt the bond and you ran." He kept his eyes on the bare trees. "Not because you were afraid of me specifically, because of what having that bond meant inside a system that didn't give you any standing to use it." She was quiet. "Yes," she said. "And every powerful man in your life until that point had used whatever you gave them as a mechanism for keeping you in a particular place." "Yes." "So running was the rational choice," he said, "not the emotional one. The rational one." She looked at him. Where are you going with this? She said. I'm going somewhere honest, he said. I'm telling you that what I want from you, what the bond wants, what I want, both of those things, is not something I have the right to ask for inside the system that currently exists. Because inside the system that currently exists, your standing in this empire is still defined by your relationship to an alpha. It's still conditional. You're safer now than you were 3 weeks ago, but safer inside a cage is still inside a cage. He turned and looked at her directly. I'm not willing to build on that foundation. I'm not willing to have you choose me because the alternative is Thorn and the law. That's not a choice. She held his gaze and said nothing. So before anything else, he said, before whatever this becomes between us, I need to change the foundation, the forced mating laws, the standing provisions, the way Omega designation functions as a legal limitation. He paused. It won't happen in a week. It'll be a fight because half the lords in that chamber have built their family structures on the current law and they'll resist. But I want it on record, with you as witness, that this is the work, before anything else. The winter light was pale and flat across the garden, and Seraphina sat with her clay cup and her hands around it and looked at him for a long time. You know what that fight costs, she said, politically. Yes. You just spent your capital surviving Thorn. You're going into a reform campaign from a depleted position. Yes. That's not strategically sound. No, he said, it isn't. The ghost of something moved across her face, not a smile exactly. Something more internal than that, the specific expression of a person whose model of another person is being revised in real time. All right, she said. All right, he said. They sat in the cold garden for another hour and talked about the shape of it. Not the politics, not the strategy, just the shape of what the world would need to look like for the women living in it to be something other than property, with varying grades of treatment. She knew things he didn't know. She'd been living in the margins of the system long enough to know where its teeth were, where the actual damage was done, which provisions looked protective and functioned as control. He listened. He didn't manage it or redirect it or translate it into his own framework. He just listened. It was harder than he'd expected. Not the content, the listening itself. 20 years of being the person whose job was to synthesize and decide had built in him the habit of listening for the actionable thing, the lever, the place to push. She wasn't giving him levers, she was giving him the texture of something he'd never had to live inside, and the texture was the point. He let it be the point. The reform edict went before the council 6 weeks later. Kaelor stood on the floor of the moon chamber without notes, which was how he presented things he'd decided on completely, and laid out the revision to the forced mating provisions, the Omega standing laws, the licensing restrictions that required alpha sponsorship, the inheritance clauses that transferred bond rights between male relatives as though the woman at the center of them was a plot of land. The chamber was not quiet this time. The chamber was loud in the specific way of men who had not been warned and were not pleased and were doing the arithmetic of their own positions in real time. He let them be loud. He stood on the floor and let the noise run its course the way weather ran its course. And when it dropped below the point of saturation, he spoke again. This empire has maintained its strength for 20 years through force of will and force of arms, he said. I'm not diminishing either of those. They were necessary, and they remain necessary. But an empire that requires half its population to be legally diminished in order to function is not strong. It's brittle. It's building on a foundation that cracks from the inside, and I've spent the last 7 years learning what it feels like when the crack reaches you. Lord Harwick, who was now the closest thing Kaelor had to an ally in the chamber's complicated new geometry, was the first to signal support. It was not enough to pass that day. It took 3 more sessions over the following 2 months, each one a negotiation that stripped something from the original language and required Kaelor and Seraphina to sit together afterward and decide what was preservable and what was a fundamental compromise of the thing they were trying to build. She came to 2 of the council sessions herself, at Kaelor's invitation and on her own terms. She sat in the observer tier and said nothing, and her presence in the room was a specific kind of argument that no amount of formal language could make as efficiently. The woman who had saved the Alpha King's life, who had held her ground against Thorn with an iron pipe, sitting in the moon chamber without a title or a sponsor, and taking up the space as though she had a right to it.
because she did. The final version of the edict passed on the 53rd day after it was introduced. Not everything Seraphina had wanted, enough to change the direction. After the vote, Kaelor found her in the corridor outside the chamber, and she was standing with her back against the stone wall and her arms crossed, and she looked like someone who had run a very long distance and was now standing at the far end of it trying to understand whether they'd arrived. "It's not enough," she said. "No," he said. "It's a beginning." She looked at him. "That's going to be your answer every time, isn't it?" she said. "It's a beginning." "Until it's not," he said, "and then I'll find a different answer." The corridor was cold and the torch above them was burning low, and somewhere in the palace the daily machinery was turning. Guards on rotation, administrators with ledgers, the vast impersonal apparatus of a country running on habit and procedure. She uncrossed her arms. "I'm not moving into the palace," she said. "I want that clear. I'll work here for council matters, and I'll be here when the work requires it, but I need my own space. The warehouse in the quarter is yours," he said. "Whatever you need it to be." She studied him. "You're very agreeable today," she said. "I'm agreeable on the things that don't require me to be anything else," he said. "On the things that do, I'll be less agreeable, and we can argue about them specifically." She almost smiled. The almost was further along than it had been 3 weeks ago. "All right," she said. "That's honest." They walked out of the palace together, through the eastern corridor and into the winter afternoon, where the capital was doing what capitals did, moving and noisy and indifferent to the individual histories of the people moving through it. The street outside the gate was full of the normal traffic of the city, merchants and soldiers and the children who ran between them. And somewhere at the far end of the long road that led to the refugee quarter, a woman was walking back to a warehouse that smelled like dried herbs and wood smoke. Kaelor walked beside her for 2 blocks before she stopped. "I can manage from here," she said. "I know," he said. She looked at him, and the bond was steady and quiet between them, the way it had been since the night in the garrison holding house. Not the storm of the first night, not the desperate pull of the weeks that followed, but something that had found its natural register, like a current that had been running underground for a long time and had finally found open ground. "Come for dinner Thursday," she said. "No guards, no Vane. Come alone and eat something that isn't palace food, and I'll tell you what the quarter actually needs that the edict didn't cover." "Thursday," he said. She turned and walked. He watched her go the way he'd watched her at the warehouse gate months ago, the set of her shoulders, the pace of someone who moved through the world with her own weather. The difference was that this time she knew he was watching, and she didn't speed up. The first snows came in the week after, early for the season, blanketing the capital in white that muffled the usual noise and made the city feel briefly like something other than what it was. Kaelor stood at the window of his private study on the morning of the first real snowfall and looked out at the palace grounds and did the accounting again, the way he'd been doing it since the day after the assembly vote. Not the political accounting, that was ongoing and would be ongoing for however many years the empire continued. The other kind. The kind that had no ledger format. He had built an empire that worked by making men afraid of him. He had been good at it. He had built it in good faith, with the genuine belief that fear was the most reliable adhesive for holding a country together when the alternative was the specific chaos that came apart at the seams when no one held the center. He had not been entirely wrong. Fear held things in place. It was a kind of order, but he understood now, in a way that hadn't been available to him before the warehouse and the working and the woman who'd walked away from him in the dark and then come back on her own terms. He understood that things held in place by fear were not built. They were suspended, and suspended things fell the moment the force holding them was interrupted. Thorn had shown him what he'd built. Men who learned from him had learned to use his tools, had studied what he did and replicated it, and when they turned it against him, it had worked because it was a valid tool for what it did. The weakness wasn't the tool. The weakness was that he'd built an empire of tools and called it a country. He was not sure yet what the difference looked like from the inside of a country rather than the outside of an empire. He suspected it was going to take longer to find out than he'd originally calculated. He suspected Seraphina already knew a great deal of it,
and was going to tell him on Thursday over a meal he hadn't cooked in a warehouse that smelled like dried herbs and the particular clean poverty of a person who had chosen to live close to what was real rather than what was comfortable. He was looking forward to it. He turned from the window and sat down at his desk and pulled the first document of the day toward him. Outside, the snow continued in its patient way, covering the capital in something temporary and clean, and the empire moved through it the way empires moved through everything, insisting on its own continuity, carrying its history forward in the bones of its institutions and the habits of its people, neither knowing nor caring that somewhere in its machinery something had shifted. Not overthrown, not replaced, changed from the inside, the way everything that changed lastingly was changed, not by force applied from outside, but by the specific pressure of someone deciding, in a moment that cost them something, to do the thing differently. One edict. One vote. One Thursday dinner in a warehouse. It was a beginning. On the refugee quarter side of the city, Seraphina Vale opened her workroom in the morning the way she opened it every morning, setting the hearth, checking her compounds, pulling back the bolt on the door that had never had her name on it and never needed to. The first patient arrived before the hour was out, a woman from the upper floors with a child running a fever, and Seraphina brought them in and set the child on the examination table and put her hands on the small hot forehead and let her focus drop down through her palms the way her mother had taught her. The work was the same as it had always been. The hands were the same hands. The world those hands were working in was different, not fully, not yet, but different in the specific way that beginnings were different from what came before them, not transformed, not resolved into something clean, just pointed in a direction that hadn't existed the day before. She worked through the morning and into the afternoon, and the snow came in under the door gap, and she didn't notice. And outside the city moved on in its ordinary way, carrying its history and its damage and its potential for something better in the bodies of the people walking through it. An empire does not change because a king decides it should. It changes because the people inside it start to believe, one at a time and in their own time, that the change is real. That belief was new. It was fragile. It would require more work than any edict could accomplish, more patience than power usually permitted, more willingness to be wrong and begin again than men who had never lost anything were practiced at. But the woman in the warehouse knew how to work with what was fragile, and the man in the palace was learning. That was enough. For the first time in a long time, it was enough.